Welcome to Voodoo Whiskey Gaming, and this is my late review of Ghostwire Tokyo. I played on the PS5, it's also available on the PC. Although it sounds like a timed exclusivity, so it may eventually be on the Xbox as well. So let's get into the story. You play as Akito, who is going to visit his sister in the hospital when this crazy, creepy fog starts basically, turning people into spirits and sucking the spirits up and away. Now, you are in a crash due to this, and then a spirit possesses you. The spirit possessing you is an individual named KK, who he and a group of his friends were trying to fight this evil that is coming. Well, and he got turned into a spirit and he possessed you to, continue the fight. And I'll say this, I think the story is a little sparse in this game. I don't think it's the strongest element. Not to say that it is necessarily bad, but I just don't think it was an incredibly strong story. I honestly think the character interactions between Akito and KK were more important than the rest of the story. But now let's get into the audio, and the first thing I'm going to say is I played this in Japanese with subtitles, and my one complaint is there are certain conversations that it's kind of hard to pay attention to because you're actually playing the game and looking at subtitles. But I do think the voiceover work was good. From what I could tell, I don't speak Japanese, so I don't really know, but the delivery sounded good to me. But I will say, I really liked the music in this game. I think the music was very good, and I think it worked very well. As for the sound effects, I think the sound effects are, for the most part, very good. I do think the footstep sound effects were pretty generic, and you hear them a lot, so you can kind of pick up on how generic they are. But as for everything else in the game, for the magic, the combat, for the creatures, I think the sound effects were well done. Now let's get into the gameplay mechanics and whatnot, and this is a first-person, open-world action game with some, and say it with me, RPG mechanics. It does feel a little Far Cry-ish in that you have to go to these torii gates to cleanse them, which will clear some of the fog. The fog will kill you otherwise, so that you can continue exploring, and when you do, it will now show you new side missions, new shops, etc. in that area. So in that way, it does feel like something you have experienced before. One thing I will say about the map, since I'm already kind of talking about that, is it looks really big when you're looking at the map, but it's actually not huge, which is kind of nice. It condenses things. And there are a good amount of side missions. There's actually a lot of side missions. But my one complaint is I feel like there's maybe just a few too many collectibles in this game. Although they do reward you for the collectibles, it's not necessarily a great reward because it's more money. And man, long before I beat this game, honestly when I was maybe a couple hours into this game, I had so much money I couldn't really spend it all. Now that being said, you are exploring in a first-person sense. You have magical attacks. You also have bow and arrow, which I gotta say, the bow and arrow felt really useless, and whenever I did have to use it, I always felt at a massive disadvantage. But you get 3 different spells, and each of them kind of handle their own thing. You have the air one, which is rapid but light damage. You have the water one, which is kind of a wider attack, but doesn't go as far. And then you have your fire attack, which is a much more powerful attack. Defeating enemies as well as collecting souls around the city will gain you XP, so you can increase your damage with your bow, with your spells, so you can basically be more efficient in combat, including stealth even. And there is a stealth element to this game, although I found that it didn't work amazingly. But I do like what they do with the gameplay overall, because there are kind of story elements attached to basically everything you're doing. They bring in certain mystical creatures to help you traverse. They do all sorts of really interesting and neat things, and they pull from Japanese lore to create their enemies. And I just thought that was an interesting way of going about it, and I think overall, while the gameplay isn't necessarily revolutionary, it does work well. Although I will say there is a lock-on type feature, and that could be better. It's a soft lock-on, but there are times where you hit it and you feel like it should have locked on, but it didn't. So that was just a little frustrating to me. As for the controls, I don't really have any complaints with the controls. I feel like they worked very well. Although they do feel just a little sluggish for certain movements, and while you do eventually get used to them, if you're coming off of like a really crisp, clean FPS, it will feel a little weird, and just in general felt a little weird to me at first. I did eventually get used to it when this is the only game I'm playing for a while, But let's get on to the graphics and visuals, and the first thing I'm going to say is it is a very good looking game but there's something about the characters that when I see them, while there is a lot of detail and they do look good, there's something about them that doesn't quite look as top tier as it could. I don't know what it is, I can't quite place my finger on it, but there's something that doesn't look quite as good as something like, you know, Horizon Forbidden West. But that being said, there are a lot of little details in your character and because it's mostly your character that you see, but there is a lot of little detail in him, in his clothing, and stuff like that I think is well done and impressive, and I don't really have any complaints there. I think there's a lot of detail in the world. I won't say it feels lived in because there's nobody around but you, but it did feel like people were there when all of this chaos happened, when everything went to shit, and I think they did a good job imparting that on you. And while it's not really a horror game, there are definitely times when you're exploring and doing certain side missions that it gets a little spooky. They get a good spooky vibe going on, but it never actually reaches being scary, and I think they do a great job building that. But let's go beyond that, and also the creatures, man. Like I said earlier, they pull them from like Japanese lore, and while I think they did a good job like incorporating them in like a story sense as well as in gameplay sense, I think the design is fantastic. Like some of these you would see and you would be straight up horrified by in real life, but I like how they brought in ones that, you know, people have definitely probably heard of, like the Slit-Mouth Woman, Kappa, things like that. They've brought in some really interesting things. They have Tengu. I just think the design overall of all the creatures, including the ones you fight, as well as just the ones in the world, are so well done. They help sell this spirit theme that is running throughout the game, and they help bring in some awesome mythology. So overall, I am actually really happy with the visuals. I think it's a good looking game. Okay, so to wrap this up, I actually had a really good time with this game. I wasn't 100% sure what I was getting into because the original trailer looked very survival horror. They later said it isn't, and it isn't. But I do like the world that they've built. I like the way it looks. The gameplay, like I said, nothing new and revolutionary, but very good. So overall, yeah, I would recommend this game. If you have a PS5, I think it's definitely worth picking up, and if it does come out on the Xbox, then yeah, pick it up. Okay, so in the comments down below, why don't you tell me what's your favorite like spooky ass Japanese creature, monster, yokai, whatever you want to call it. And as always, thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit that like button, and if you like what I'm doing in general, share and subscribe. Have a good one.